the return of the Abdalis. And the middle of the 19th century, when the British were positioning themselves for the great game in Afghanistan, and were being repeatedly pushed back by the Afghans, the Durrani tribes in the south around the drug country were busy in an internal strife, and it was not over poppy. A Barakzai faction that prided itself for its intellectual ethos and Persian persona had no stomach for violence, and therefore migrated to Kashmir, known both for its worldly and heavenly assets. In the bargain, Barakzai's grandfather married a woman from the Vale and thus had children who were half Kashmiri on birth. Since the émigrés could not live merely on the beauty of the paradise on earth, a title bestowed upon this piece of territory by the Mughal emperors, the clan drifted south and settled down in the neighboring district of Gujarat, which in 1947 became part of Pakistan, a miracle of the Almighty over which discussion in the country never ceases, and where Barakzai's father married in a Yusufzai tribe. Osama was so christened on the advice of the family saint with Arab heritage. To further confuse his DNA, he was born in pre-partition India and became a Pakistani while still in primary school. No wonder he had a problem finding his roots, took Buli Shah's Ki Janran Main Khan, I have no idea who I am, literally, and defied all efforts to be pigeonholed. And unsurprisingly, therefore, defying conventional wisdom became his vita lampada. At an early age he started doubting the existence of God, but changed his mind on Machiavellian grounds. If there turned out to be a creator in whom he did not believe, he would be in trouble, but if he retained faith in an Almighty who never existed, it should do him no harm. In due course, however, he did become a believer. Again under the spell of some convoluted logic. His thesis ran more or less as follows: since man could not possibly fathom the concept of infinity in time and space, there must be a supreme entity who did, and that could only be God. One could bet that this man was destined to be perpetually in trouble. This penchant was further aggravated when told that though far from being a genuine Pashtun, he could still pass for one if he did something odd every now and then. But again, like a pragmatic settler, he knew when he could not. As he was interested in mathematics and philosophy, he was expected to be a true disciple of Bertrand Russell, who had combined these two disciplines like no other mortal. However, after reading about Russell's logic on why he was not a Christian, if everything must be created by someone whom we should recognize as God, then who created him? He no longer believed that these most exact or the most profound of sciences were sufficient to explain the mysteries of the universe. It was not because by that time his faith in the Almighty had been restored, but more because very often the events did not follow the most logical course. While taking a midterm test in his early school years, he did not do well in one of his favorite subjects, arithmetic. That should have taught him a useful lesson, to guard against overconfidence and not take things for granted. But when it happened ever so often, just when he had convinced himself that he had covered all the flanks and success was inevitable, something grievously went wrong. He started believing in the hidden hand of fate and decided that instead of exercising caution he would simply follow his instincts. The result was obvious: he got away with his vicissitudes as often as he did not. He was a good student till he was not. And that landed him in the National Guards, a force crafted by the hidden hands that knew Pakistan had to fulfill a divine mission and could, therefore, not be run by ordinary mortals. And, of course, it was structured on tribal principles in keeping with the laws of nature. In due course, another country, Saudi Arabia, also adopted this concept in the belief that the Holy Land too could not be protected by conventional means. And, indeed, Iran after its religious reincarnation implemented this doctrine rather starkly in the form of the Pasadaran. Osama Baraksai's instructor at the academy was a Pongo, relying more on his feet than on the map he had to carry. With his trigonometric skills, Baraksai often helped his teacher when the latter lost his way or the sense of direction. To return the favor, he got Baraksai commissioned in a branch of the force where he could use his skills to the optimum. Though a bit dismayed when he could not, he still had learned enough from his setback at school that one could always bounce back. Not enough, though, to chart his course more carefully. He acted erratically so often that his colleagues used to mock him as a rebel, a philosopher, even a crank. Given a choice, though, he would rather have worked to lower his golf handicap. Ultimately, it paid more dividends than learning the skill of arms. In a crucial phase of his career, when he might or might not have been catapulted to the higher echelons, Baraksai's regional commander, a scion of the Mughal clan, was so impressed with his swing that when he moved up the ladder to take over the National Guards, he took Baraksai along to spy over his rivals. Neither the new tribal chief nor his spymaster lived a dull moment thereafter. 2. The Game of Thrones. Kram Mughal was fond of playing in the big league, except that he was not very good at it. A few soldiers of fortune recognized his weakness and got under his skin. They convinced him that he was ordained to guide the nation to greater glory. Baraksai, in the meanwhile, had gotten so fascinated with the wider world, which was getting narrower all the time, that he was reluctant to be distracted by these lowly palace intrigues. Time and again he warned his boss that where a superpower, the Soviet Union, had recently run out of steam, Mughal would have no chance of restoring the kingdom of Oz. But the problem was that the chief's kitchen cabinet was packed with the remnants of former dynasties that had been consigned to the dustbin of history, and were now seeking revival by riding over the coattails of the big chief. Two of them would later play prominent roles in the country's politics. Gul Mohimed was once the head of the country's premier spy agency. Though brilliant in his own right, he was upstaged by the other, Nuvan Sheikh, who had befooled some of the best brains in the country by simply playing a dummy. In a prolonged battle for power, the National Guards toppled the reigning queen from a feudal family, only to have a mercantile house grab the throne. That may have helped Baraksai move up the hierarchy to become the country's top spymaster, but in the bargain, both he and his boss had to make some Faustian deals. True to Goethe's prophecy, the devil took charge of their souls. Baraksai still trundled along for a while, perhaps because he operated in the shadows. Mughal, however, continued to lose traction. The legacies that he wanted to leave behind, a new world order and glasnost, concepts later adopted by the two superpowers, had gone awfully out of kilter. He had misplayed the favorable hand that fate had dealt him. During the aforementioned battle royale, having failed to gain a firm foothold in the corridors of power, the soon-to-be dethroned tribal chief was now striving to give the country a fresh Code Napoleon. The route he chose was through laying a foundation for which he went around raising funds while still lording over the National Guards. At one stage, advised by Mohimed, Mughal told Baraksai to visit the Holy Land and, besides seeking divine forgiveness, ask for Mughal's share of the worldly treasure. The ruling princes, however, had at that time some other concerns. A Mesopotamian Chief had occupied a neighboring state that was overflowing with liquid gold and was now threatening to rob the kingdom of its oily glitter. In desperation, the king, though crowned as the Almighty's Caliph on earth, sought help from his worldly protector, the mighty US of A. In Baraksai's judgment, the Bedouins were in no mood to be distracted from warding off the threat to their royal dynasty and therefore very reluctant to get involved, once again, in our region. They had had enough of Afghanistan and the jihad imposed upon them not by Allah but by their earthly masters. Back home, Baraksai made one more effort to warn his chief that the latter's claim on total wisdom would soon end along with his office, and he should therefore start seeking forgiveness for his sins. It was too late. The desperado had already coerced an accountant to steal from his bank. Baraksai was tasked to ensure that a few crumbs reached the right mouths to keep them shut. More on it later in the story. The world, in the meantime, was unraveling at breakneck speed. Soon after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it had lost its equilibrium and now had a unitary system with an upstart regime at the helm. Since the new ringmaster, the United States, had no sense of history, it was not likely to have learned any of its lessons, one of the most important being that the empires stretch themselves too thin. That led many of its former friends, including Pakistan, a country that had helped the US vanquish its rival, which had provided the much-needed balance in global politics, come on the wrong side of the sole superpower, not only because it was now shooting all guns as in the Wild West, but also because it had ganged up with the country's arch-rival in the East. In due course, Baraksai left the service and was looking forward to blowing apart many a myth. In the closing decade of his active service, he had closely watched Pakistan move from one-man rule to what was intended to be a democratic disorder. The above-mentioned imbalance in the global system was also in the National Guards his subject to watch. Indeed, Baraksai was now raring to tell the rest of mankind that it had got it all wrong. Some of his well-wishers, however, realized that he was not yet ready to take on the world and maneuvered to send him in exile under diplomatic cover. It worked for him, widened his horizons, and fed his ego, since the outside world always got excited when told that the new kid on the block was in fact a former spymaster, now masquerading as an ambassador. All this exposure, processed through an Aquarian mind, helped Baraksai claim entry into the exclusive club of security analysts. Lucky for him, Pakistan, which was once considered the pivot of the universe only by its natives, had in the meantime drifted into the eye of the storm by the great power's insatiable desire to dominate the region described by Mackinder as the heart of the world. Island Russians had, of course, learnt this principle from their infatuation with chess. He who controls the center of the board wins. It is not clear if the US remained obsessed with the subcontinent to play one country against the other, or because it considered itself the successor of the British Empire. The collateral beneficiaries of these never-ending great, or not so great, games were the likes of Baraksai, who were now in great demand to unravel some geopolitical mysteries. Once on the track 2 circuit, which he often called a circus, because it went around performing the same act, and usually with the same actors, Baraksai met Ranveer Singh, a former Indian intelligence bigwig, who, though a police officer in his prime days, was equally eccentric. In keeping with the local folklore, Kub Guzra ji jo mil bathainga divain do, madcaps are comfortable among themselves. They often sat and sipped together. That generated anxiety among the other participants, who, though no longer in service, were still suffering from institutional hangover. They suspected that the two mavericks might be exchanging state secrets. It was only when they made some joint presentations on issues like intelligence and Kashmir, which they had dealt with on their watch, that the others recognized the value of a dialogue between professionals, provided they were prepared to grow out of the offices they once held. It is not easy to track down who all might have suggested that the duo could now co-write a book to serve as a compendium of Indo-Pak affairs. Even more difficult is to judge the real intent behind such an outlandish proposal. In hindsight, it seems it was a conspiracy to get the two of them in trouble. Both the authors, however, still believed that they had a holy mission. Maybe they did. 3. The road to hell is indeed paved with good intentions. On a rare occasion when the Indian deep state was not looking, Baraksai sneaked across the borders, bribed his way to Delhi and asked Singh to take him to a wise man who had roots in the saintly city of Herat. The man was then a big shot in the Indian hierarchy, but in that meeting all that he asked of the two was to do something to bring the madness in the region to an end. And that was when they made up their minds to seriously work on the proposal made by their mischievous colleagues. The book that they wrote together was titled A Spies Handbook for Peace, from Huron referred as the Spy Book. Indeed, it was bound to create commotion, not because of its contents, merely two sets of narratives, with a sprinkling of spice, but its authorship. How often do intelligence chiefs, even if ex or axed, from two unrelentingly hostile countries jointly proclaim that the mutual acrimony could be overturned? Even then the uproar that followed was not exactly what they had bargained for. Singh, though quite critical of some of his country's policies, still got away with a few glowers and grimaces, possibly because the Indian polity admittedly is more accommodating, perhaps also because of his standing in the public. Baraksai, on the other hand, had ruffled too many feathers during his service and, for reasons that took time unraveling, he came in the crossfire from many a quarter. For the political circles and the media, always a little wary of the security establishment, it was an opportunity of a lifetime to unleash their fury against someone who, having shed his protective shield, was now easy game. But it was his erstwhile institution that went all guns blazing and shook this former mafioso ace out of his characteristic smugness. Though he had reasons to feel gratified for his efforts, the blowback was precisely as his palm lines had always indicated. Just when he believed that he had accomplished something spectacular, he would be brought crashing down to earth. The impact in India was awesome. Some quarters were understandably upset because the book was not exactly music to Indian ears. To add to their woes, though Baraksai was frank about some bloopers made by Pakistan, his defense of the country's policies was reasonable. The real dividend for both the authors came in the shape of generous praise lavished on them by some highly regarded Indians from politics, media, and academia. Almost all of them agreed that Delhi's muscular policy in Kashmir was brainless. Because muscles had no brains, a remarkable phrase coined by a former ally of the Indian Prime Minister, now his sworn critic for having lost the battle of hearts and minds in Kashmir. At home, on the other hand, Baraksai was stunned by the screams branding him a traitor and a foreign agent who must be hanged, along with the Indian colonel caught fishing in the troubled waters of Baluchistan, which dominated the Pakistani landscape for days on end. Some among his friends, fans, and family were indeed anguished, but for the others it was one of the rare occasions to relish schadenfreude at its best. It didn't really matter if one had read the book or not, as long as one could rub it in gleefully or raging with anger one was in business. Some of the saner elements did try to bring sanity in this din, but to no avail till both the ears and the throats went numb. It would be a long time before any of that would start making sense to our shell-shocked antihero. Strangely, he received so many messages about barking dogs that he actually went out looking for bricks. What prevented him from pursuing his impulse was a saying by Churchill: if one started throwing stones at every dog that barked, one would never get anywhere. But an old Orientalist friend from Germany provided the real solace. He reminded Baraksai of a subcontinental pearl of wisdom: dogs keep barking and the elephants move on unconcerned. The problem was that strictly under the watch of his former department, he could not move. And he was no elephant. It was still for him a unique opportunity to separate wheat from chaff. Whereas a few of his old colleagues and some others were out to settle some secret scores, complete strangers either conveyed their sympathy or stood up to voice support. Delhi too, in the meantime, had caught up with the cacophony. Baraksai got a call from Randhir Singh. "Ars, what's all this noise, boss?" "Ob, a storm in a teacup, I think." He tried to sound nonchalant, but the seasoned spook at the other end was obviously not convinced and persevered. "Ars, but why? I thought we had a marvelous launch. Your recorded message was a great hit. More importantly, our recommendations on Indo-Pak relations were endorsed by the strategic communities whose who and the Kashmir issue got all the limelight. Ob, I'm sure it would help once the dust settles down. Right now, the press is milking the event dry. It should provide boost to the book sale. And by the way, the title of the worse media that I had reluctantly surrendered to India in the spy book, I'm claiming it back." "Ars, not so fast, Osama. Some of our nasty anchors are gunning for me. I believe their criticism of the book will relieve some pressure on you." "Ob, thank you, Randhir. If this furor was about the book, it may. But I suspect it is not. It's not every day that they get a chance to pillory a former intelligence bigwig, also because it's too risky to hit the real target of their ire, the incumbents." "Ars, if you say so, boss." Singh remained skeptical. 4. Preparing for the altar. T was the 29th of May and the year was 1988. Zia-ul-Haq, the then President of Pakistan, had dismissed a government that was godfathered by him, and now it seemed that he was running out of options. Many therefore used to wonder how the great survivor would recover from yet another self-inflicted crisis. But, like always, the hand of God came to his rescue. 30 years later, precisely on that date, yet another ordeal was to unravel, which too might need some divine intervention. A day before, on the 28th of May, someone rang up Baraksai on his cell phone. "Sir, I am Colonel Lek from your old office, and I am standing outside your gate." He went out to bring the caller in. The man looked uneasy for having literally gate crashed, but calmed down when told that old Baraksai was familiar with the clumsy ways of Lek's department, and when heading it was often embarrassed by the modus operandi of his operators. And, in any case, he was wondering what was taking the Brotherhood so long reaching out to him. "Sir, I only wanted to tell you that the Chief of Staff, Kos, will ring up shortly, and I have been tasked to ask you that till further instructions from the Central, if you would please not talk to the media." Baraksai had left these talking circuses long time back, but still found this stipulation a bit strange. All the same, he assured Lek that he had no intentions to go public on this subject. Sure enough, shortly after the visitor left, and probably gave the green light to the right quarters, Baraksai got a call. "Sir, this is Hilal. Sorry for ringing up so late. We are trying to manage a rather unusual situation, the clamour in the country about Baraksai hobnobbing with the enemy, and if we could request you to come over tomorrow. Of course, we will have you picked up. And, sir, if you could please avoid the media." Baraksai told Hilal that he completely understood, was sorry to get his old institution in this spot, would be ready at the appointed time and, of course, wondered about the media bit. It was Major Abdullah who escorted Baraksai to the lair the next day. He was also from the same department as Lek, the Corps of Special Operations. Both of them were, therefore, in some awe of a person who had founded their branch of the National Guards. En route, when told that they were heading for the Special Services branch, it had Baraksai a bit worried. That was the place where at times they prepared suspects for the Nuremberg trials. What reinforced the apprehension was the star-studded reception line in the corridor. This was the first and the last time he was so received, and was reminded of a bride's welcome after marriage and the fate that awaits her. Tipu Sultan, a 3-star general with scholarly looks, Baraksai had seen him somewhere, was accompanied by 2 dour-looking ones, both wearing 2 stars and who would make a good prosecuting squad anywhere. All 3 were carrying bump that looked very incriminating. Once inside the office, the stage was set for a guilty verdict. The chief disciplinarian fired the opening salvo. "Your introduction in the spy book is well written, but was it necessary to say that you were born an Indian?" "Yes, because I was, and before one forgets, even Iqbal, our national poet, has written how he loved the country of his birth." "Hindustan," was Baraksai's response. "Thank Allah, I was not born before Pakistan, otherwise I too would have had to love India." "But, sir, tell us why you did not get our permission before writing this book." The battle had indeed been joined. "Not sure why. Probably because I, once in the chain on such matters, never came in the way of those who wanted to write without permission, or because I have been talking about all that is included in this book for quarter of a century. Also, because I have written joint papers with my co-author that are now on the web. And, most importantly, since many with similar credentials never sought your blessings before writing books." When asked who all wrote on security matters without the Central's permission, he named a former Qas, Wahid Aziz, who had decided to break the silence, and also Gulrez Shahrukh, who, while still sitting on top of the national heap, had made sure there was never a dull moment in Pakistan. Of course, no one was going to tell Baraksai that the headquarters had cleared these books. The former was very critical, and the latter rather embarrassing. But that does not mean that anyone could now go ahead and write a book in violation of rules. One of them nearly screamed. It may mean different things to different people, but in legal terms it was setting precedents. Baraksai rejoined as calmly as possible, but then had to ask if there was any rule that required him to seek permission before writing a book. The trio exchanged puzzled looks before one of the 2 stars, now occupying Baraksai's former chair, shot back, "Yes, that provision was inducted in your time." It was a blatant lie, and one could safely conclude that, given enough rope, this delinquent would hang himself or Baraksai, if he became the president of a kangaroo court. Baraksai never found out his real name, but everyone called him Hafiz, which in the vernacular is normally used for a person who can recite the Holy Quran by heart, but also for someone who is blind. Osama guessed that he was given this title because of his blind loyalty to his boss. His bull-headed faith ultimately helped Baraksai decode his mission. Hafiz was also rather uncouth. When asked for how long after leaving the service the ban on writing books remained valid, till the grave, was the response. Baraksai had to advise him that the next time the answer could be better nuanced, as long as one lived, for example. Besides being the polite way, it might discourage the mischief makers from living too long. Tipu Sultan tried to save the situation by a little diversion. Maybe this precedence thing would save you in a court of law, but you can certainly be hanged for divulging secrets. Osama had known a thing or two about secrets and therefore could see that this bunch was bluffing. If I have, I would shoot myself and spare you the trouble, but before that you would have to reveal those secrets to me. While saying that, he tried to look cool, to let them know that their bluff was not working. And he could see that Sultan was now moving uncomfortably in his chair. Yes. By claiming that the Tehreek-e-Hurriyat Kashmir, thank, was founded under your watch, you have conceded, contrary to our official stance, that we were involved with the freedom struggle in Kashmir. Baraksai now had reasons to suspect that the trio had been given a task that went beyond the book, and was also reminded of a few remarks from his neighbors who had been watching the fireworks on TV. These chaps have not read your book. The other was even more incisive. They seemed to have been given an agenda. And that was when Baraksai made one of the rare wise choices of his life. If he played by their rules, there might just be a chance that they would spill their designs. The thank was to provide the resistance with a political umbrella. And giving it political support was the state's declared policy. Moreover, retaining leverage with the mujahideen of all shades had often been justified by Pakistan as an instrument to keep control. Baraksai, therefore, asked his tormentors why they were getting so nervous this time around. Yes, there was a problem. The Indians had generated 1 billion posts on social media that a former intelligence chief had finally conceded that Pakistan was abetting the terrorists in Kashmir. Baraksai could see that while saying so the bespectacled boss was feeling guilty, and therefore had to water it down by adding that he believed that the idea of creating this body was a good one. It was now Baraksai's turn to return the compliment, as he had in the meantime recollected where they had met the last time. Thank you for saying that. I knew that having headed the country's top think tank you would recognize a good act when you saw one. The book was written for people like you and not for the Twitter generation, and, incidentally, our involvement, beyond the political, was admitted by Gulrez Shahrukh in his book that I have just mentioned. He may have made all the right points, but for Baraksai's prosecutors, who saw their game plan unraveling, it was time for some emergency measures. They were now audibly cursing Shahrukh. And our man in the dock, who once used to do the same, was praying for his long life. I would thank him the first thing if and when we meet. Baraksai whispered audibly. The head spook was now in panic and quite expectedly dropped his guard, for which also Osama should thank him sometime. Did you, sir, at any time get the inkling that the book launch was timed to provide relief to Navin Sheikh? Sheikh was one of Deep State's many discoveries to serve as its public face, and like most of them, he was constantly on the look out to see how best to dismount the tiger that had catapulted him to power. Having been groomed by his father in the politics of patronage, he would look for aides who owed him unflinching loyalty. As Prime Minister, he often went deep down the seniority list to pick the next tribal chief in the belief that so chosen, the man would remain beholden to him for the favor. It always backfired most seriously when Gulrez Shahrukh, third on the list, when selected by Sheikh, sent him packing at the first available opportunity. Back in office, Sheikh selected Jabar Jat, whose father-in-law was a close family friend. Jat not only got him disqualified for the job, but also unleashed the NGPR to subject him to intense media fire. When the spy book made its appearance, the crosshair moved to Baraksai, much to the chagrin of the deep state, and indeed to Sheikh's great relief. Baraksai was now tempted to ask if that was the reason. Some people outside were indeed whispering about it, that the Central was so incensed with him, but then held back just in time, if for no other reason than to let the babbling Bobby keep digging deeper in the hole. He also did not bother to explain that it was not easy to time the launching of a book with something so unpredictable as a fired prime minister shooting his mouth off. And when at a later stage someone propounded the theory that Sheikh could have been prompted by the Indians to make that statement at that particular time in history because the rescue was underway, Baraksai was reminded of the good old advice that is almost always lost sight of. Words are often not adequate, silence always is. His reticence paid dividends as Hafiz kept spilling more pearls of wisdom. You took more space in the book than the other two combined. No doubt he was a die-hard intelligence man for whom a book jointly written by two former spymasters could not be about anything other than speaking less and provoking the other to blabber more. As politely as possible, Baraksai had to enlighten the blind man that books were about what one believed must be conveyed. And how. He also reminded his interrogators that the second Indian was only the moderator and not an author. The session had been prepared very well. If not the three generals, at least their staff had gone through the book and must have worked hard to pick points that could be spun around to suit their nefarious enterprise. But it was not really necessary. The decision had already been taken to hold an inquiry and, as the unkindest cut of all, ban Baraksai from leaving the country. And, of course, he was told, for the third time in less than 24 hours, not to talk to the media. It was the talk of the town by the time Baraksai got home, and had been broadcast around the world in 80 seconds. The malice in the project became a bit clearer when he realized that, having denied him the right of reply, not that with the dice so heavily loaded against him it would have mattered, the media hounds had been unleashed against him. Did he hear the ex-servicemen among them using the same arguments with which he had been bombarded in the lair that very morning? But the most important task for Baraksai still was to untangle the knot that the Brotherhood had woven around him before it became a noose. That evening, Nuvan Sheikh rang him up. "N.S., General Sahib, heard some bad news this morning and thought of touching base, also because it has been such a long time." The glee in his voice was palpable. "Ob, thank you, Prime Minister." That was how Baraksai always addressed people who had ever held an office by their last title. "N.S., so, what happened?" "Ob, much has happened in the previous many years, but a few things have not changed." As Sheikh struggled to make sense of this message, Baraksai spoke again. "Ob, those in power continue to make bad decisions. It is not Very often that a prime minister gets that many chances to appoint people in high places and never once gets them right. Apparently, Sheikh was still not getting it. Ob, it used to be because of your father's influence. The latest blunder seems to be because someone's father-in-law led you up the garden path. NS, yes, this time he got it, I will be careful next time. Since Baraksai had long held that this creed could bounce back even from the death cell, from exile, always, he didn't contest the fired Prime Minister's claim to another stint in office, only that he would do any better. 5. Langley awakens. In 2018, George Pompas was heading the JIC, the Joint Intelligence Committee created by the American Deep State. In a monthly conference in June, he opened the proceedings on an unusual note. Ladies and gentlemen, before we take up the regular items on our agenda, I thought we will quickly get a minor matter out of the way. I believe there is some commotion in the subcontinent, and it's not about Afghanistan or Kashmir. I understand that it's about some secret links that the RA and the ISI have established, but someone seems to have blown the lid off them. Mac, could you tell us more about it? Mac Gibson was at the time the director of the South Asia Division and was known to be a cool cat. With his characteristic nonchalance, he briefly responded, "Nothing very significant." George. Two maverick spy chiefs from the previous century are trying to regain attention and have cooked up a joint chronicle. That sounds interesting, Pompas said, but why then all the hue and cry? Hope they haven't shared any of the doctored notes that we keep bombarding them with. I don't think so, boss, otherwise our station chiefs in Delhi and Islamabad would have sent us red cryptograms and our ambassadors there served subpoena on the two governments. My office had put up a printout of the digital edition, but after scanning a few pages, I found it rather run-of-the-mill and therefore decided to wait for the hard copy. In any case, the windbags in both the capitals are now back to Yankee bashing. So, the God is again in his heaven and all is right with the world. I am glad to hear that, but do send me a copy whenever you can. Now we can get on with the agenda. And the first item is, I can't believe it. The president is again asking us to open an overt channel with the Taliban. Pompas had an uncanny sense for when something wasn't right. Back in his office, he asked his secretary to get post-haste a few copies of the spy book, have Charles and Marvin, the two on his staff known for their ability to read between the lines, go through them and put up a brief first thing Monday morning. After he had read the two briefs, the person the director summoned next was Bob Kenny, who had been in and out of South Asia countless times and knew his way through many sensitive corridors. Bob, I am sure you have heard about this book, even read it. I don't like some of the stuff written in it, but let me not inflict my views. You can go through it on your own, but what I want from you is to find out as much as possible about the two authors, their motivation, their standing with the present intelligence community, and, of course, why they, after their infernal plan unfolded, came under the scanner, especially this Osama chapter. Baraksai's favorite place to meet his guests, especially students and researchers seeking his assessment of events past and present, was the Durrani Cause at Islamabad Club. It saved him the trouble of hosting them at home, but the collateral damage was that his presence there could almost always be taken for granted. Sometime in the last week of June, he received an email from one David Smith, who said he was writing a book on Afghanistan and had been referred to him by Stephen Cohen, a well-known South Asia scholar. Baraksai agreed and Smith arrived at the club at the appointed date and time. He said that he had been in Kabul the past 3 days and the title of his book, therefore, was Afghanistan. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. After a few pleasantries, the visitor whispered that he in fact was from the American establishment and had some urgent business with Baraksai. Baraksai was familiar with these ploys and bluntly told Smith that to start with he would have to prove his credentials. In response to Smith's query, "What type of proof?" Baraksai simply said that was for him to figure out. After a short pause, Smith sought Baraksai's permission to call his colleague, who was waiting in the foyer. As per the good practices of business, Baraksai should have refused and told Smith that he would think about it and then give his answer, but then decided that at his level he had enough confidence in his persona not to be constrained by such mundane norms, and gave Smith the nod. The man who came in looked more like a Terminator than a spook but spoke very softly. "General, I am Terry Rubin, and indeed we knew you would ask us to prove our credentials." If Smith had given any signal or these fellows had their brains wired was difficult to judge. But Osama still decided to keep a poker face. "I can see, Mr. Rubin, you are carrying a notebook." Without batting an eyelid, Rubin pulled one out of his side pocket. "Sir, while visiting our headquarters in March 1990, you alerted us about the Indian build-up on your borders. It was not a bad effort." Baraksai had indeed mentioned it on that visit, and when the JIC sent a fact-finding mission soon thereafter to the two capitals, one of its members used precisely the same formulation during the delegation's call on Baraksai. He still said, "Please continue. You are a tough customer, General, and might be thinking that we could have shared that piece of information with many others. True, we did, but never used your name. However, let me also recall that in the early 1980s, when you were a defense attaché in Germany, our team gave you an exclusive briefing on Afghanistan. Yes, it happened so, but that event has been mentioned in my memoir." Though taken aback, Rubin quickly recovered and spoke almost inaudibly. "In Geneva, in April 1990, you did not only meet the security minister from Kabul. And, of course, you could not have mentioned it anywhere. All right, gentlemen, what do you have in mind?" The duo had obviously passed the test, but when Smith said, "We want us to work together," Baraksai took time to assess the moment. A transmission of that nature must never be taken at face value. Essentially, it is to read the reaction made to someone with Baraksai's status. It could often be seen as provocative, even disparaging. Baraksai intended not to respond and simply give a cold stare, but for Smith's intervention. "Sir, you often walk alone." Osama of course took his daily walks, not only to tone up physically but also to clear a few cobwebs that kept infesting his thinking on unrelated matters. Lately, it had been mostly after sunset, and on the last few occasions he had an eerie feeling that he was being followed. The implications of Smith's statement were obvious, but there was no way Baraksai was going to give him the satisfaction of knowing that it had had any effect. Putting on a little smile on his face, he turned towards Smith and said, "If I were still in service, I might have asked you to train some of my men in the discreet art of shadowing." And then he became somber. "People get bumped off all the time. Some of them suffer a heart attack when walking. But one category that is always put out of the way is that of the hired hands who had served their purpose." Surprisingly, it was Rubin who had been tasked to play the good Cop. General, Dave is new in the business. Of course, we know that. You would not work for anyone, especially a foreign secret service. An act that you have often described as beyond redemption. Baraksai was quite impressed that Reuben had taken the trouble to read his writings, in which he had once cited the fate of Pollard, an American agent, who was incarcerated for years for passing secrets to the friendliest of all agencies, the Mossad. Reuben resumed with an extremely serious and sincere-sounding countenance, but we are very keen to talk to you on issues that are of our common interest, and on which your views are highly regarded. Baraksai ignored the flattering part. I talk on these issues all the time and have discussed them in great detail in my various writings. Lately in the spy book that has made a few ripples. So, why did you have to go through this dramatic process to discuss them with me? Baraksai was now clearly mulling over the JIC's hidden designs in this exercise. Reuben turned out to be a gifted interlocutor. Sir, you are also known to tailor your discourse according to the occasion. We very much hope that you will give us a different insight for old times' sake. And if you do agree, sir, we will collect a few of the best brains from our partner agencies to make this exercise worth your while. However, if Baraksai consented, it was for a purpose different from what this smooth-talking agent had in mind. That evening he exchanged a few posts with Ranveer Singh. Yes, I too have been approached. But then I recalled advice you once gave to the Indian government. I have told the Yanks to buzz off. Baraksai should have done the same. But then maybe his decision would one day be vindicated. He was always known to be a gambler playing for high stakes.